Hello. As one of the members of the organizing committee, I said I will say yes to making the final kind of concluding remarks. What I can share with you, and I'm sure all the members of the organizing committee feels the same, is a deep sense of gratitude to all of you. That not only did all of you come here, but also all of you brought yourself in your entirety and contributed so much to the panel discussions, to the keynote lectures, and to the breakup, workshops and so on. And one thing that I really felt was that there was a sense of community. And in fact, that was actually one of the hidden agendas of this conference, that through this kind of gathering and informal networks would form, individuals, you get along each other, some don't get along each other, some connect. That's what we human beings are. This is what we are. And I noticed that a lot of people were able to do this. And it was such a joy, for example, when Don Lopez stood up and hugged someone whom he hadn't seen for many years. So it was really wonderful. So I think in that respect, the sense of community was really palpable. And also, everybody expressed their deep gratitude to Eric and Andrea and Thupten and Tsadra Foundation. And I feel we should also recognize particularly Eric's contribution. Eric shared his story about how he came across searching for Buddhist books in France, and then, wandering around the streets in London, particularly in the Bloomsbury area, coming across, I would say thank you to that bookshop. In the Tibetan tradition, as an ex-monk, I've spent a large part of my life as a monk. And, those who are familiar with the Tibetan monastery will know that each monastery has a protector shrine. And in that protector shrine is one important protector, which is the Norla, wealth god. And the custodian of that protector shrine's job is, among other things, propitiating the Norla of that monastery. So Eric and Andrea are like the Norla when it comes to the Tibetan Buddhist translation world. So I would really like to take this opportunity to really acknowledge this. And I would also like to thank Andrea for really being 100% behind Eric's Tibetan Buddhist adventure. And as a Tibetan, I would like to thank Andrea for your tremendous support for the Tibetan people and their welfare through your work of Trace Foundation. Some of your staff members are here, and the Lhasa Library, which exists in New York. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for that. All of us who are here are familiar with Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and one of the 7 limbs is rejoicing, Jesu Yirang. There is a beautiful line in one of Tsongkhapa's poems when he says that Beba chungu labjian cho duba gela Jesu Yirang chotosum. Says one of the most excellent way to accumulate great waves of merit with the least effort is to really rejoice in the good deeds, so the Buddha has taught. So I would like all of us to take this opportunity to rejoice in what the good deeds of Eric and Andrea, as well as the Tsadra Foundation, but also all of our good deeds in coming together here. I thought of recapping the sort of the highlights of the 3 days, but I decided that I won't be able to do any justice to the tremendous depth and breadth of presentation we were exposed to. But I thought I would probably identify some of the recurring themes that kept popping up. We had essentially 2 kind of moving parts. One was translation, the other one was transmission, and the third part was somehow the combination of the two, which was kind of hinted in this morning's panel discussions topic, which was authenticity and myth creation. So I thought I would sort of pick some of the key themes that kept recurring. Now, on translation, we were really treated to a tremendous feast in the form of Professor David Bellis's lecture. It was just, he set out of the terrain. We were taken all the way before the Common Era itself, when what we know as translation began. He also shared with us the kind of experience and challenges he faces as a translator, the choices he has to make, and the responsibility to the reader and so on. I think that really set the tone and set the agenda and really cast this vast net so that we don't get kind of sucked into this confined area of the small Tibetan Buddhist translation world. On the second day, and it was actually Woolston who's made the recommendation to invite David Bellis. So my hat's off to you. It was really a fantastic suggestion. On the second day, Professor Janet Gyatso really opened this whole thinking about what we mean by transmission and how does it relate to the process of translation. And she particularly drew our attention to the concepts and the categories that exist in the Buddhist tradition, as well as particularly in the Tibetan tradition. She identified 3 trios and how those kind of understanding, those kind of concepts in relation to some of the new ideas that are coming in contemporary research may actually shed light against each other. And intriguingly, she made the suggestion that knowledge has something built in it. There is a desire or will to kind of communicate. That was an intriguing idea. So now on translation, some of the key kind of themes or topics that kept recurring was a sense of joy in the pursuit, except for Woolston. And also the recognition that translation is a complex creative process, that someone even said that it's like an art. That's why what makes it joyful. People talked about how the act of translation itself, allow us to bring deep awareness and mindfulness, into our work. That was another theme. And then the other theme was the kind of the injunction, be kind to your reader, and what does that involve? That was another important theme that came up. One other important theme that came up in the context of oral translation initially, but then it sort of developed into written translation as well, was the whole question of visibility versus invisibility of the translator in the act of producing the text. There was also a recognition that in the end, it is really the responsibility of the translator to avow whatever the product he or she is producing. I mean, that's all you can do. So those kind of things were, I think, very thought-provoking. Carl particularly spoke about the more practical issues of what are the specific qualifications and skills you will need to actually begin doing something like translation, which I think was also very important, because in the end, what you have is a person sitting down in front of a computer and a text, and you have to do something, So I think those were very, very, important point. And then there were, now I have to wear my glasses. Then on the question of meaning, there were a lot of interesting ideas. I mean, in the question of translation, again, the question was left, what is that it that is being translated? On the meaning, there was a suggestion that maybe it's this Tibetan concept of gongpa, intention. Maybe that's what is being brought across. Janet Gyatso particularly kind of took that to task and questioned whether we need to open it up, and whether there is more to meaning than gongpa or intention. There was a suggestion that meaning is probably understood better as an embodied, experiential, something that happens to the body, and what are the extra-lingual or linguistic or extra-verbal dimensions of meaning that are being transmitted. Although Dr. Bellows did not bring it up in his presentation, but in his book there is a very intriguing or thought-provoking suggestion that what is it that is being brought across the text is best understood as what he calls information and the force of the utterance. I leave that up to you to figure that out, but I've personally, when I read that, I thought there is something in there. Information, which is the semantic content, and then the force of the utterance. And I would urge all of my colleagues to mull over this. And then there was a question, how do you square all of these multidimensional meanings of meaning with the practical necessity of sitting down in front of a text and producing something that is meaningful? Now, on transmission, again, there was a lot of discussion, triggered by Janet Yatso's wonderful, keynote lecture about, that knowledge is not to be conceived as something static, but something that is active. And also, she curiously alluded to or referred to Derrida's, idea that just as contract, can only be completed when the other party signs, in the same manner, there is a kind of a reciprocal dimension to this idea of transmission, what is being transmitted. I think there is something there which is very, feels very profound. And then, what is the role of the body in the transmission? There was a lot of discussion of that. And also, John Canty gave a really helpful list of things that we should take into account when thinking about transmission. And that was very helpful. I've been trained classically in the Tibetan tradition, and we love lists, lists and outlines. And one of the most interesting point that came up in the context of transmission and meaning was this idea of a relational character of that nature, whatever it is. And that kept coming up, although it was never fully fleshed out, but I think there is something in there. Now, this morning, when we were trying to bring the two, of course, we saw the culmination. This morning's panel was probably the most spark-filled panel. It was from the word get-go with the exchange between Woolston and Don Lopez. It was an exciting conversation. And also what this points to is a kind of a tension. I wouldn't call it conflict, but the tension between the two contrasting perspectives, two myths. Thank you for bringing that Mary Medley's, kind of quotation. So I think, I would urge for the practitioners community to really take academic perspectives quite seriously. Someone reminded us that the critical inquiry is actually in the DNA of the whole historical development of Buddhist ideas. Buddhists have been historically skeptics. That's in their blood. The rejection of the Atman, rejection of theism, that kind of skepticism is, and deep commitment to empiricism is really built into the very DNA of Buddhist ideas. And of course, there is then the question of how do you juggle between two conflicting narratives and all the rest. And I have a feeling that this is something that each individual will have to find some kind of resolution. And in some cases, the resolution may not be rational. It may be an emotional adjustment to a particular kind of resolution. So I want to, kind of convey you that this is not a desperate situation. It's not a kind of a, pernicious doubt that undermines the depth of your faith. But in fact, if it is embraced creatively, it could really enhance our understanding and appreciation of the text. And I do get occasionally criticize myself from my own fellow Tibetan monastics, because a large part of my work, although you see me working only in English, but a large part of my work is actually in Tibetan. And in these texts, when I edit them, I write intro essays, and I bring the historical perspectives on some of these texts. And then, of course, then I sometimes annoy some of my colleagues. And one of the things, and I don't want to take too much time. Okay, we still have a little bit of time. Okay. One of the things for me, a takeaway home message from this is a very, very hopeful message. That for me, right from the first day, I was very impressed by the substantial presence of young scholars and translators here. And also, one of the things that also heartened me is that there's at least more than 50% of the people who are here I don't personally know, which is always a good sign, because the world is not getting insular. So I really take, I was deeply, deeply, encouraged by this. And since there is a fairly large number of young translators, I thought, as an experienced, quote unquote, translator, I could share some of my own personal experience of how I go about, dealing with some of the challenges you face as a translator. My own career as a translator really began in an accidental way. I was a young monk in South India, happened to be one of the very few who had some facility with English. And, at the age 12, around 11, 12, I picked up the language. And thanks to hippies in Dharamsala, I had an opportunity to practice some of them, with some of them. And the monastery moved down to South India to an agricultural settlement, which meant I had no access to speaking English. And I ended up reading comic books. There is a series in India called Chandamama series. It's an Indian kind of mythologies. And then Second World War German comic, kind of, war comics. And then I began to read a fair bit of Agatha Christie's and so on. And I, basically self-taught and listened to radio on a daily basis. And so when I first began interpreting for His Holiness, my language was very bookish, actually. It was quite kind of archaic. But in the 85, I accidentally happened to be in Dharamsala. The interpreter was not in town. They were looking for someone. One thing led to another. I ended up translating. A few days later, the secretary said, His Holiness wants to see you. So I had an audience. As I walked in and prostrated, His Holiness looked at me and said, I know you. You're a good scholar. He said, but I never associated your face with someone who spoke English. And then he said, some people tell me that you have an easy English to listen to. Would you be willing to travel with me? Of course, I broke down in tears, as a Tibetan. I mean, this is like completely unthinkable. So, and that was in 1985, and that's how my career began. And it's only, I did a couple of short texts here and there, but the real translation began when I established the Library of Tibetan Classics series and established the institute to support that. And I began with a mind training Lojong Gyatso text because I've always been a great admirer of Lojong. That has been my main practice for a long time. So how do you do? I mean, one of the things that I find really helpful is when you approach a text that you have chosen to translate, it's really important to develop as broad background knowledge as possible around that text. That I think is one really important step. The other one is, as a Tibetan, I'm translating, my translation is L2 approach because English is not my mother tongue, and I shouldn't be actually, strictly speaking, doing that. I should be translating back into Tibetan. So because English is the second language to me, I do a lot of reading of completely unrelated material, fictions, biographies, nonfiction, that are written in a more creative way, and also poetry. Not English poetry, but poetry that are translated into English, which in a strange way is more accessible to me as a speaker of English as a second language. So for you, I would encourage you to really develop a taste for reading Tibetan for pleasure. I know the texts are difficult, and part of the difficulty really comes from the way in which the texts are formatted. in our classic series, we produce critically edited modern versions where there are paragraph breaks, subheadings, comprehensive list of contents so that you can digest the text in bite size quite easily. But I would really encourage you to read as widely as possible so that you don't get stuck just with your text. There are biographies. I mean, for example, those who are not familiar, there is Doring Pandita's Namtar, which is one of the most beautiful kind of, easy reading in Tibetan. It's 2-volume. It's completely, it's an aristocrat's autobiography. There are texts like this which you could read. I think that's really important. And then the other thing is to really, if you are particularly working on poetry, you should really read it aloud and sing it or chant it. Tibetan language, all of you are familiar. It has a rhythm. And especially in the poetry, depending on what genre poetry it is. I tend to love the Guru genre. And Guru genre has a particular rhythm that models the folk song, Tibetan folk song. That's why Milarepa Gurus are so popular among the laity, because it sort of echoes, simulates the kind of sensation of listening to a folk song. So I think that it's sort of, you know how Tibetan works, but it's helpful to kind of, feel the rhythm and feel the cadence and feel the poetry before you actually start translating. So I think that's very important. And then also one thing that is important for the translator is that not all translators are good writers. And we have to admit this. I am a great believer or admirer of Clint Eastwood's line in one of the Dirty Harry series, when he says, man has got to know his limitations. And I take that to heart. So for me, I've been very fortunate to have David Kittlestrom, who's standing here, who's down there, who actually makes my prose look better than they are. And because there is a level beyond which my command of the English simply doesn't allow me. And I know that limitation, and David helps me. So I think even though English may be your native language, maybe you don't have that particular extra level of writer's gift. But for the reader, that extra dimension makes a huge difference. Because after all, we are all emotional creatures. We like to think we are rational creatures. If we motivate ourselves, we pull ourselves together, we'll be able to sit down and tough it out. Up to a point, not beyond that. But on the other hand, if the text is laid out beautifully, the spacing and everything, if the language is done well, after a while the reading becomes a joy. And that will make a big difference. So I think I cannot overemphasize the role of a good editor. So please, this is where you need humility. And I think it's important. In my case, if anything that I write needs to go to print, I never give it without it has been looked at by a native English speaker. This is as a matter of rule. I just don't do it. And I think this has really helped me a lot. So I think I wanted to share that with you. Okay, so finally, what I wanted to do is to really, I was going to say a few things about my stories, but that's fine. So what I would like to conclude is to invite all of us to really kind of dig deep into ourselves and reconnect with this principal motivation that has brought all of us here in this beautiful Keystone resort at this conference, and here also to this Tibetan tradition, to which all of us have chosen to devote a large part of our life, for which we have chosen to be passionate, and which we see as an anchor in our spiritual life. And let us reconnect with that. If we reconnect with that kind of larger motivation, the important of that is, this will bring a sense of joy in your pursuit. One of the great insights of Buddhist psychology has been the importance of the role of joy in sustaining motivation. And in fact, in the Mahayana conceptualization of Tsundru, The definition is Tsöngkang Gela To. Tsundu refers to taking joy in a good deed. So joy is built into the very concept of what Tsundu is, and that's a powerful insight. So now there are two ways in which you can get a sense of joy. One is the sheer pleasure of the act itself, which is what the modern theorists call intrinsic motivation. Not all of us may not be that fortunate, but if we connect with our deeper aspiration, when we accomplish something, we can take joy from having made that accomplishment. And also, I don't want to self-congratulate ourselves, but also we should not underestimate the long-term impact of what we produce. There may be benefits down the line that we cannot even imagine. And yesterday, two more minutes? Okay. David Germano talked about how the Buddhist ideas and the contemplative practice are now coming into domains of normal public kind of life. Mind and Life has been at this intersection of Buddhist ideas and practices on the one hand, and scientific rigor and discipline and research on the other. And so I personally believe that I don't want to proselytize Buddhism, but at the same time, I genuinely believe that bringing many of the key Buddhist ideas, such as concept of interdependence, universal compassion, some kind of self-awareness about the dynamics of thoughts, emotions, and behavior and how they affect our habits. These kind of fundamental Buddhist ideas, the more we can spread in the world, the better the world will be for everyone. And that is the Bodhisattva motivation. And that is what motivates His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness the Dalai Lama does not go out and say, oh, how can I spread the Dharma? For him, service to the world is first, and serving Dharma is a medium for that. For me too, serving the world really is the first, and my service is through serving the Dharma. So I think, Tsongkhapa reminds us that when we rejoice in our own deed, the important element is not to fall into self-congratulations with a sense of conceit. Then it gets ego, aggrandizement. But we can, at the same time, take joy in our own accomplishment with a recognition that it connects with our larger motivation. And in the end, I believe that we are all not only rational beings and emotional beings, but also we are all inherently meaning-seeking creatures. We all always strive to matter. We seek purpose in our life. And I, for one, find the greatest purpose through my work of translation. Thank you.